Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. Please let me know if you can hear me well right now, and let me know if you can see the presentation. So please use the chat and confirm that everything is fine. Cool, thank you very much for the conversation. So let's jump right into the session intro. So hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar by Qualistory in cooperation with UPRI. My name is Jan, and I'm your host for this session. Today's discussion explores the topic how to create a GxP-compliant temperature mapping report. And in this webinar, you will learn practical strategies, tools, and insights to simplify the process of creating temperature mapping reports and ensure GxP compliance. And our partner experts from UPRI, Adam Hartman and Jakob Konradsen, will guide you through the steps of mapping, reporting, proper data collection and storage, navigating regulatory requirements, and avoiding common mistakes. The session will be around 60 minutes, and it includes a Q&A session. And please stay until the end, because then you will also receive a certificate of attendance. And now I'm eager to introduce to you our speakers today, Adam Hartman, the co-founder at UPRI, and Jakob Konradsen, the co-founder and head of quality at UPRI. And I will let them take the stage from here. So enjoy the session and happy learning.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Jan. I'm just taking the lead here for a moment because Jakob is sitting in Copenhagen, and I'm here in Raleigh, North Carolina, in our office. And it seems like we just need a couple of minutes for Jakob to get all his wires connected correctly. Let me see. Jakob, are you getting there? Hi, Jakob. How's it going?
It is going great. Thank you very much.
Great to see you. Is the weather still bad since I flew a couple of days ago?
It is still bad, yes. It's very much the same in cold Copenhagen.
Well, that's how it is in this time of the winter. Well, as I said, thank you very much, all of you out there. Thank you, Jan, for hosting us once again, and thanks to Jakob for being here. I'm super excited to host this particular webinar about how to create a GxP compliant mapping report, which is something that Jakob, you have significant experience with and is doing for customers in UPRI worldwide, basically. So let's dive into that. I will just mix your screen, Jakob, for a moment to present us. First of all, what is UPRI and why do we talk about a topic like this? We typically would line it up in this fine little circle here that what we do in UPRI is that we develop and invent solutions to basically make temperature compliance a one-stop solution, meaning that you have access to monitoring, validation, and calibration in one suite of softwares and hardware solutions. All in all, it means that you're just able to get through an audit super easy and comply with the regulations that you need to live up to. This is really what we care about, and this is really what we do in UPRI. We make systems and solutions to make an audit really easy. So this webinar is going to be about a particular thing within validation of cooling equipment, particularly, or warehouses, etc., where we're going to talk about how to make that mapping report. And Jakob, I think on next slide.
Sorry?
You can just go ahead with the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah, and to present that, as Jan said, we have Jakob Konradsen, my my very happy co-founder of GxP. We started up this company 10 years ago after we'd been working for a while with the area. And we just realized that we could invent a lot of different things. And the reason why Jakob was really the go-to guy here is that, you know, I'm constantly saying that, but you know, your background in space engineering gives you a bit of credibility in terms of the ability to invent stuff and create ideas that are a bit, you know, ahead of us. So welcome, Jakob.
Thank you very much.
Let's just,
yeah. So thank you very much, Adam, for that very nice introduction. So I think I'll take it from here. As is in the title, some of the things that we'll go through today is, first of all, defining baseline, what is the mapping process. And today we're going to talk about the final step of that process, which is the mapping report, where we're going to finalize all of our findings. We're going to document it, and we're going to hand it over to operation. So we're going to look at the basic requirements, and there are many different units that you can map, but today we're going to go from the WHO standards guidelines, which is basically mostly looking at larger warehouses, but this can also be applied to fridges and freezers, incubators, any type of temperature controlled unit. We'll also do our standpoint, as I said, from the WHO guidelines. There are many other interesting guidelines to follow, such as DKDR 5.7. There's the ISP temperature control chambers, which you can also always follow. But I always suggest, if starting out in the field of temperature mapping, to go with the WHO guideline, as it's free, it's very easily readable, and it gives a very good foundation for doing both the protocol work, the execution, and the final reporting of the mapping. And then lastly, there's a bit of questions and answers. But as always, if you have any questions along the way, we have our colleague Anya as well here from GxP sitting on the chat. And as well, I'll try, if any interesting questions pop up, I'll try to answer them on the fly. So don't hold back in terms of putting some great questions out there. But without further ado, I think we'll just start off. First of all, it's important to understand where are we in the journey when we're talking about temperature mapping reports. So as always, the mapping process starts with the protocol. And in the protocol, we define what is to be mapped and which method are we planning to use to map it to achieve the desired results. Not as to what results we hope to get, but the methodology to get us there. Which kind of data do we hope to gain? Which kinds of insights do we hope to gain, so that we can come with a qualified guess to as whether the unit or the warehouse or the piece of equipment is within acceptable ranges. Then we have the execution phase, where we actually set up our data loggers. We do our measurements. We document how we set everything up, and how we align with the protocol. And then it comes to the reporting part, which is the one we're going to focus on today, which finalizes a lot of the efforts. And then hopefully we should get the unit or warehouse, fridge, freezer, whatever you want to map, to a qualified state. So from this standpoint on here, the first important thing to keep in mind is what is actually the purpose of the mapping report. This is something that we sometimes see that is being sort of misinterpreted, but basically at least the mapping report should show the results. So which kind of data did we acquire during the mapping study? And it should also include the conclusion. So what is it we can conclude based on that data? Do we fulfill the criteria that we set out, or did we not? And the last part, which is often missed, are recommendations. So which recommendations for operational use or commissioning could you set forth based on the data that has been gathered, based on the execution? You might have several deviations during the execution, but basically, what are the recommendations for use? And we'll get a little bit more into detail as to why that is actually important. Secondly, the purpose is to be the final documentation. That's also some of the things, a point sometimes that we see people missing is that the report is the final piece of documentation on the mapping studies. That also means that if you have any recommendations, conclusions, findings, or whatever, the mapping report should basically be updated. We sometimes see the pitfall where there's been some data gathered, the report has been finalized, and then afterwards there were some findings in terms of deviations or extra insights, but those should all come in the study report, so that when an auditor or an internal quality unit doing internal review, for example, opens up this report, it has everything associated with mapping, with the specific mapping that has been performed. That's quite important to remember. And then lastly, as I also mentioned before, guidance on the use of the facility or equipment. So there's often the misconception that a mapping report will produce a binary result. It's either good or it's bad. It's either within acceptable range or it's not. In my view, there's a lot to be gained in doing non-binary conclusions. So basically, what can be done in terms of operational use of a facility or a piece of equipment that will minimize some of the risks that were found during the mapping study. So basically, should you open the doors less, or can you actually do it more than you plan to do? Do we need often a high degree of maintenance, a high degree of technical review of the unit? Those are all recommendations and guidance that should be placed in the mapping report. Of course, only within the scope of what you're actually able to define with the data that you've obtained during the mapping study. So with those few words, or maybe a lot of words, I think we can continue as to what are the basic requirements that are set forth in the WHO guidelines and the ISP guidelines in terms of what should be in a temperature mapping report. And again, don't hold back in terms of putting some questions in here or any discussion points where you might think that I'm wrong. It's totally fine. So heading out here. So WHO has a series of recommendations. They have a whole section on what should be in the mapping report. And from the top, this should at least hold an introduction. This might seem fairly simple, but it's something that we often see neglected. I think it's important to keep your reader in mind here. So who is going to read this report? In all honesty, auditors rarely have time to read both the protocol, all the filled-in test plans, and then the report. So a good mapping report should contain an introduction to as what is the scope, when has this been performed, why was this mapping initiated? That's often something that's left out. Is this because it was an initial use of the facility? Is this because there's a remapping going on? Is this because based on a risk assessment, for example? All those things should be in the introduction as to make it more readable for the auditor, the internal or external auditor, or customers who wish to assess what kind of activities have been performed at this facility. Furthermore, it should contain conclusions and recommendations. So basically, as we'll go into detail with all these points later on, conclusions are basically statements about conformance to the requirements of the facility or equipment. And that should be in the report. It's not enough to just present the data that was obtained. It's also required to make conclusion based on that data compared to the specifications for either the process or the equipment. And as well, recommendations. Are there any changes to the facility or equipment that are recommended? Are there any recommendations to the use of the facility and so forth? And we'll get into much more details about this. There's also a series of annexes that are expected. When it's stated as annexes, this shouldn't be taken literal. Those could be compiled in the report as well. But sometimes some of them make more sense to do as an annex to the report. But there are no strict requirements in terms of whether you keep them as annexes or whether you choose to keep them in the report. So first of all, you should be able to document where data loggers were placed. And we'll get much more into detail as why that is very important. It should include raw data. It is not precisely described how this raw data should be contained, but it's industry standard to compile the raw data as every single measurement in a table-like format. You should contain graphs, and we'll have much more details about which kind of graphs should be in there, because there are many different variations to how you can present your data. You should also identify hot and cold spots. That's something that there's often a lot of focus on, and I'll try to today to give some insights onto how you could define hot and cold spots and how you can actually define hot and cold zones. We'll get much more into details with that. And you should actually append the filled-in test plans. And this has much more to do with good documentation practice and traceability than it is to have a good report. But basically, there is a general requirement that all the test plans that were compiled during the study, they need to be appended to the final report. And you should have your deviation reports. So, and we'll get much more into details with this, but basically what went wrong, if anything, during the mapping study? Did you deviate from what you wrote in the report? Did any of the methodologies change due to practical reasons and so forth? You all need to compile that in there. And that's again to create traceability between the user requirement specifications and the design specifications, and transferring that into the mapping protocol. So the methodology that you've chosen in order to prove acceptance with the acceptable criteria that derives from the user requirement specifications and so forth into your mapping protocol, those should live onto the mapping report, and there should be a clear link between those and any deviations between those specifications and the final reporting. Yeah. And lastly, sort of a more technical matter, you should have your calibration certificates. And we'll go much more into detail as to why that is important.
So, I was just curious about a point on the last slide. Now that I know you guys out there can't see it because I'm shuffling my own picture into the view, so I'm sorry about that. But what you just saw before, Jakob, is the WHO guidelines on what to generally have in a mapping report. So my first question is, like, how sizey is a report like this? We just saw the list of annexes, and I don't know, you have like, I don't know, warehouse with 100 different data loggers, then you have a couple of certificates to add, right?
Absolutely. I think as an example, as part of for example, appending calibration certificates, there are tips and tricks to follow. One thing is, if you have your equipment under control, having a centralized place to store those calibration certificates, you can often get away with referring to where those are stored, rather than having to do copies of them and placing those alongside your report. But the basic guideline is that you need to have those calibration certificates, and you need to be able to review those calibration certificates. So if you don't have a permanent link to where those are stored, often we see a lot of people tending to just print them out or keep them digitally and store them as an appendix to this. I would say that the minimum requirements, as we have listed here, is also what we consider to be absolute minimum requirements to have in a report. But I think as a note to add to that is also that one needs to decide on how readable a mapping report should be. Basically, you can go through these basic requirements and let that be your report. That will often lead to a report that's only readable if you also read the protocol. A decision somewhere needs to be made as to whether you want the reader to both have the protocol and report in hand in order to understand the full context, or what we often like to do is actually to do a more comprehensive report that summarizes the criteria listed in the protocol and the findings as well, so that you have in my view at least, a better connection between what was the methodology that was proposed, what was actually conducted, and what were the findings and the data observed during the study. That gives a more readable, it also becomes more comprehensive, that for sure. But all in all, the time it takes to copy paste basically a lot of the requirements and the methodology in is outweighed by how much more readable your report gets. Absolutely.
Nice. Jakob, I took the liberty while you were speaking to post a poll just to give you guys out there an idea about what is the majority of the listeners here in the webinar. How are you guys working with mappings? And this is the poll that came out of it. I forgot one thing though, and that was the ask about like how many of you don't do this on a regular basis. So I'm sorry about that. I didn't want to necessarily leave you guys out. But it seems like we have some few of you who really does this on a very regular basis, right? And then most of you, is almost 60%, is in a once a year kind of scope on mappings. Jakob, can you touch base in like you're doing this on a very, very regular basis with your entire team, flying around and doing exercises like this week on week. But what does it mean to, like, when you look at this and the the expertise that is typically required to do this, like, what is words on this kind of division of people here?
I think this clearly shows as well the relevance of keeping oneself updated on these procedures and the different requirements, because we tend to see two different groups, larger groups of our customers at least. The ones who do it regularly, they tend to do to have a good confidence in terms of risk management, in terms of how often you need to remap it, and the performance of it is it's also clear that reports are meant to be read and meant to be an active part of quality management. And the other part, which do it less often, is often where we see that there can sometimes be a need to refresh sort of the some of the methodologies behind this. But I can totally understand that if this is something you do every year, that this field changes. There's regular updates to different industry expectations, especially from governmental auditors and from certification bodies. What we see though is that if the general guidelines, as we'll go through today, are followed, it's very rare that causes issues with auditors. Most definitely.
Nice. That's I think that's spot on, and a really relevant and interesting talk, because this is something that will keep following you. Like you say, you document this entire package of information in the report. You archive that somewhere, and then you take it up once in a while during an audit. So it's something that will basically keep onto you for a while afterward.
Absolutely.
Cool, Jakob. I'll leave the mic to you again.
Thank you very much. So going on from what the minimum requirements are, I think there's maybe one important. I can see there's a lot of activity in the chat here, and that's one of the most asked questions we also see on the ISP forum, is how often should you remap? I think once and for all we can try. I can try to give some inputs on that. The basic requirements as put forth by mostly the ISP standard is that it needs to be based on a risk assessment. So how often should you map? We have hundreds of clients that do a lot of different things. I would say that the industry standard from our viewpoint is something like every 3 to 5 years if there are no major changes. And what is major changes? If we're talking smaller units, changing compressors, changing door seals is something that could influence your risk willingness, basically. For larger warehouses, it's rare that you have really large changes that will force you to do a remapping. The thing that we see most often influencing the results of a mapping are changes to operational procedures. So if you start using the rooms for different purposes, if the adjacent rooms start to be non-temperature controlled or temperature controlled to a lower or higher temperature, that's something that will have a large impact. If you perform regular reviews on the constant monitoring and the tendencies in here, if you perform regular technical review of the HVAC systems, it's very rare that there's a high risk that you'll be non-compliant. That's not the same as to say you won't have a negative tendency in terms of maintaining within those acceptable ranges. But often for larger warehouses, it takes rather large technical changes for you to be non-compliant. So again, rule of thumb, large changes or every 3 to 5 years. That's what we see at least. So I hope there was at least some input to the discussion I can see going on in the chat here. Moving on to today's main topic, the mapping report. First of all, the introduction. A pitfall that we sometimes see is not being able to identify specifically what unit was mapped. This is one pitfall that's very easy to mitigate. But basically having a serial number, we often see people or some of our customers are good at identifying serial number on standalone units, but for warehouses, which exact room was mapped and does not have a specific name. Scope, I can see some mentioning of seasonality as well here. So the mapping report, what does it encompass? Which kind of tests were performed? Which kind of seasonality is included in that? Which kind of scenarios did it test during? Was it normal operation or was it a artificial scenario where you have stability study, loading study, power failure studies? That scope is really, really important for an auditor to get an idea of what activities were performed and what can I expect of results when reading this. When and how. So basically, when did you perform the mapping? That's also really important. We see a lot of cases where it's stated that it's a winter mapping, but as you know, the weather does not always read our mapping reports or our protocols. So stating when exactly those studies were started and when they were ended is truly important, specifically when we're talking larger warehouses. And how did you map? What were the rationales behind it? Did you choose any specific standard to follow or did you deviate from that? That will give the reader a much better introduction as to what it was that you attempted to do and which methodologies do I need to have at the back of my mind when reading your report. So another large part of this is, of course, also conclusions and recommendations. And this is something that I feel strongly for. I think there's a lot of value to be gained in writing good conclusions and recommendations. And I think there's also another point that's really important to take from this is that when we as quality people or us who work with mapping, sometimes, and including myself, have a tendency to focus on my own language and my own terminologies. But I think it's really, really important, specifically when writing conclusions and recommendation, is to understand who is the reader. Do I hand this report over to the operational team and how will they read the conclusions and recommendations that I have made? Who is going to use this in their daily operation? If you understand these things, if there's a truly good both language and also idea behind it, I think it can be an incredibly powerful document, the mapping report. But as to the contents, first of all, I think it's very important to focus on non-binary conclusions. So what is a binary conclusion? First of all, stating that it's accepted or not accepted, or compliant or non-compliant, especially when we're talking temperature mappings, which are a very living thing. Only stating that it's either in compliance or non-compliance, I don't think it cuts it. So rather than that, I think it's important to state which parts of the facility are within limits, which parts of the facility are at higher risk of not being within limits. Also remembering that we do a mapping study of, let's say, a week, 2 weeks. The only thing we can guarantee is that the second after we take down our equipment, things have changed. There are a lot of things that change all the time, and there should be room for some variations when making your conclusions. We can only guarantee the temperatures at those specific points where we place our data loggers, and we can only conclude on it at that point in time. Things change all the time, so giving much broader recommendations is really something that we see add a lot of value. So what are your recommendations for how to use the facility? Can we give recommendations saying, during the study, we found that opening the door every half an hour caused no deviations, but if we did it every 15 minutes, it caused deviations. Well, yes, then we have some inputs for the operational team as how to plan entering and leaving the facility, and even more importantly, if you're talking fridges and freezers, we should give recommendations that alter behavior. That's really, really important to keep in the back of your mind. Again, recommendations to the use as risk zones as well. If we see some points that have a larger variation in temperature, and we'll also get back to this in terms of how you represent data in graphical format, can you identify some areas which are better suited to store sensitive goods and some areas which are less suited to store sensitive goods? It's often not a clear-cut case as whether something can be used, because if you have large packaging, it's going to be less affected by temperature variation than if you have smaller packaging, which will be more affected. So often what we find as an example is that location close to doors and gates, those will have larger variations than those placed far away from those doors and gates or windows or the HVAC system as such. Furthermore, one of the recommendations that's really important to consider is, do we recommend to remap this? We might find that it's within acceptable range, but that it's very, very close to not being within acceptable ranges. This is something that I believe that we as validation engineers should take upon ourselves to do. It is perfectly legal to recommend a remapping after some technical adjustments to the facility. This is something that we don't see often used, and I believe this to be a matter of cost and time. But basically, it's important to remember that recommending a remapping is truly also something that can be part of the mapping report. Again, how to use the facility and equipment, I think we've been around this enough, but basically, again, remember who is going to read this. There seems to be a large focus on the auditor who's supposed to read this, but remember, this should be a living document that can be used internally for operational and performance reviews of the facility or equipment. Yeah. So moving on, data logger positions, and you might, this is part of what needs to be in the report, and you might ask yourself, why would I need to do that? I've already stated in my mapping protocol where I tend to place those data loggers. And this is a pitfall we often see people falling into, is that they will take the positions from the protocol and copy paste those into the report. But I have yet to see a single mapping concluded in a larger warehouse where every single logger was placed exactly as planned. And that is totally fine as well, that things are being moved in order to take into consideration practical situations. There might be positions that cannot be reached at that specific time of the study. There might be places where a door was moved slightly or any other such things. And therefore, it's really important in your mapping protocol to produce rationales. We have a whole webinar on how to do that as well. But what is the rationale? If you have a specific location where you plan to place a data logger in the airstream from the HVAC system, for example, and you put that on the drawing, but when you get out into reality, you can actually feel the airstream being 2 meters to the left or up or down. The rationale is that you want to measure the airstream at the closest product position. And as such, it doesn't matter where the dot is on the map, it should be in the airstream. And those things should be documented. So you should ask yourself the question, we wanted, can this experiment be replicated? Experiment is not a word that we use often within the validation word, but basically, as I said before, we're doing an experiment right now, and we should be able to replicate that. So if we don't document the positions of data loggers, someone who might be interested in doing the same again in a year or 3 or 5 years needs to be able to see what positions were used then. Otherwise, the results are not really comparable. So another good thing to keep in mind is pictures of the specific locations. This is something that is so easy to implement, especially for fridges and freezers. It can be in one picture. You can take a picture of this entire thing. You can see all the data logger positions. It's a little bit more cumbersome for larger units and warehouses, but it pays back often. We've seen a large amount of cases where the picture documentation could actually serve as a good input for doing deviation reporting afterwards. Because in some cases, you could have positions where the data logger is placed just behind a wall, maybe it's just shielded from airflow, whatever it might be, in which the image shows exactly where that was placed, and you can actually trace back and say, this is why we get odd data from that specific location. Another thing is that it proves that if you take pictures when you're executing mapping, you're setting up your data loggers, when you're taking it down, if you see that there's a logger where it does not seem like it was placed exactly there, you can always go back to the picture documentation and ensure that that logger has not dropped down or been misplaced. Especially when we're talking larger warehouses, there's often people operating the facility whilst you're doing your mapping study, and they tend to be very good people with good intentions, so that if a logger falls down, they tend to place it back to where they think it was. But that could actually cause deviations, and we need to be able to handle that. And again, as I said before, are all data loggers placed exactly where you planned them to be? If not, that is totally fine. We just need to ensure that we take that into account when we're analyzing the data. So if a data logger was moved, we need to analyze whether that will impact the results that we're given. But we need to be able to prove and to be able to document that where it was placed and how that deviated from the initial thought, and that the rationales behind placing it exactly there are then met. I hope that makes sense. Otherwise, please shoot me in the chat here. So another thing that I think is often a point where you can add a ton of value to your mapping reports is how you do graphs. As it's stated in the WHO guideline, it just says graphs. So in theory, you could choose anything to satisfy the regulatory requirements. I know that WHO is not the regulatory requirement, but it is something that auditors look for when assessing. So what we see on the top right here is the classical time series data. And this is often what we're seeing when asked for how to present the data. And I think this is a really, really good baseline for how to present data. It shows tendencies, it shows you something about the overall distribution of temperatures without being very specific, and it also shows you stability. But there are things that time series data cannot do. So again, this is a classical. There are things where other types of graphs gives a much better representation of data. And this is where our bottom picture here, box plots. I would really hope that some of you would take this on and try to use these. Box plots will give a very nice idea of how temperatures are distributed throughout your volume. So this is a simple example here of position 1 through 10. And in general, the middle line shows you the median value. You can also do it as an average value. But it also shows you how much these temperatures vary over time. I must remember to say that the top graph and the bottom graph are not correlated, but we need to find something that gives a good indication here. So what can we actually read from a box plot? Well, we can see how temperatures due to the average value are distributed. We can also see if we have temperatures where there's a large variety. That could cause us to come close to an acceptable range and therefore be non-compliant. it also shows you if there are areas where the temperature is very stable. And we'll also get back to hot and cold spots just in a while, where we can use block spots very intelligently to say what are generally the hot zones and what are generally the cold zones. But using box plots in an intelligent way is a very good way to indicate that you've understood that temperature distributions are not only their average value or their peak value, but you've understood that it has to do with the variability of temperatures. Another important factor to remember here is that if you have a large thermal mass, such as a palette of products, those will not be affected by a single high or single low temperature. Those will be affected by generally high or generally low temperatures. So there's a lot of ways to use this. I think we could talk on hours for how to use statistical analysis for these. Another important thing that we don't see as much used are heat maps. Some more simple ones, as we'll get some examples on later on. But they also give a nice indication of where do we see general issues with hot or cold spots, but we'll get much more into detail with that. So I think the basic idea is that it's so important to understand that what we're actually trying to do is go from what we have on the left, which is very 2D, which is very simple data for us, to something that looks more something like on the right. We have temperatures that are distributed throughout this space and volume, but we also have a time component. So this is an example of a heat map that we perform for a customer, in which we see what the reactions are to shutting down this temperature controlling unit. But it's our responsibility as validation engineers to convey the message of the data on the left to something that is actually spatial and time dependent. So there's definitely a lot of different tricks and tips and tricks to use this. So getting back to hot and cold spot, this exactly leads us on all this data. What are we going to use it for? Well, basically, we're using this data to identify risk zones and identify what WHO guidelines and ISP guidelines identify as hot and cold spots. But again, what is a hot and cold spot? Is it due to peak values? If we measure just the one single highest measurement, is that a hot spot, for example? Is it the average values? What about measurement uncertainty? All those things, in my mind, should be taken into account when actually identifying what I'd much rather call hot and cold zones. Because if we take our example from here, we might have several loggers that are all candidates for being the highest, either by average, by peak temperatures, or by the 90% percentile, as an example. Those are all what we should consider hot zones. Because again, we haven't measured every single square centimeter of this volume. So in that sense, there are several candidates for where there's a generally high temperature and where there's a generally low temperature. And again, are there areas where there's generally high variation, or there's zones that have generally low variations in temperature? And this is an example of what we typically like to do, is actually pick out a zone that's at high risk for being warm and a zone that's a high risk for being cold. And that is where you should recommend placing data loggers. But it's also really, really important to remember that there could be several different candidates which are distributed at several different locations. So therefore, it's often not enough just to place monitoring sensors at the hot and cold spots. So again, yeah. So moving on, I can see we're running short on time here just a bit.
Then I won't disturb too much, Jakob. You're better suited to know how much time we are. I just had some, but we'll come back to that in the Q&A.
Absolutely. So another important thing here is deviation reports. I should mention that we see it being accepted to both keep the deviation reports as separate reports, as appendices, or as part of the reporting. That there's really no rule or the golden rule in terms of how you should do it, but it is required, and it adds value to identify these deviation reports. First of all, identifying what went wrong. Did you deviate from the protocol? Was that your deviation? Was there a mistake happening during the execution of the mapping, which you should then take into account? It's really important to being able to identify exactly what went wrong. And this leads back to what I said before about picture documentation, having the filled-in test plans. That should all lead to a link of a series of traceability that can then help you identify exactly what went wrong. And then something that we often see forgotten. One thing is that we have a deviation report and we try to mitigate it maybe, but how does this impact our mapping results and our conclusions? This is the key factor that an auditor is going to look for. Is, yes, there was a mistake or a deviation somewhere during the execution or the protocol phase, whatever, but have you considered how this affects the conclusion of the mapping? Does it affect the validity of what we're trying to conclude on here? In most cases, it might lead to a greater uncertainty of our conclusions, but it's very important to be able to identify how it impacts it and whether it means you should have a remapping. Lastly, assess the criticality. Does this mean that we have to perform a remapping, or does it mean that we can continue, but that we'll have a greater amount of uncertainty on our conclusions? The criticality part is, and the impact on conclusions is the most critical one, because you need to be able to determine and defend for an auditor whether you continued with the same results or whether you needed to do a remapping. And that's going to be a really key part in any deviations. So again, to the question, I think you brought it up here, Neil, as well. When should we raise a deviation? And I have some typical examples of what those could be. First of all, it could be data logger failures. And that could be due to technical reasons. It could be due to the data logger falling down, breaking, or not being in the position anymore where it's supposed to measure. That's a very typical one we see, especially with large warehouses where there's still operation ongoing during the mapping study. It could be calibration errors exceeding the limits. So when you perform your initial calibration and your exit calibration, if you chose to do so, if either one or the other is outside those calibration limits, then what can you do? Well, it does not mean you can't use the data. It just needs to, you need to assess what impact does it have on our conclusions. So often when we're talking data logger calibrations, we'll have an MP, a maximum permissible error, and we need to be able to identify if this is higher than we expected, should we then account for that when we're making our conclusions? So often deviating calibration results is often not a big deal. It just needs to be considered when mapping, when producing your recommendations and your conclusions. One of the other big deviations we see is interruption of mappings. So you might have set forth in your protocol that you needed to map for 2 weeks without interruption, and then someone enters the facility during that period. That's a deviation, and we need to show that if we have some temperature variations, that we can trace that back to when that person entered the room or exited, or whatever might have happened. If we see spurious data, we need to be, if we can't justify it with having a clear idea of it was because someone opened the door or some other issue, well, then our deviation report will not have any meat on it, and we won't be able to identify exactly what it matters for the conclusion. And again, data logger placement is one we often see. If you have hundreds of data loggers that you need to place, you might have 1 or 2 or 3 data loggers that were not placed where you anticipated it. That's totally fine as well, but it's still a deviation from the protocol to the final report, or to the execution and then to the final report. And it's totally fine. You just need to assess whether that has any impact on the final conclusions. One trick here is to, when you identify the data logger positions in your protocol, to allow for some personal judgment when actually setting out, like stating that data loggers can be moved 1 or 2 meters in any direction. you assess that as part of your risk assessment during your protocol work, that won't have a large influence based on the design ideas, but it leaves some room as to not have to do deviation reports when you're actually mapping report. So one of the last topics here, calibration certificates. It's a very fundamental part of being able to document that your equipment was measuring correctly within an acceptable range. So having that in place is really a baseline. But another thing sometimes we see is that calibration certificates are not reviewed. So having a calibration certificate is fine, but if you don't review the results in there and make sure that the calibration errors are below your acceptable ranges, then it does not add a lot of value. As I said before, sorry, jumping a bit ahead here, the calibration results should input into your conclusions, and you should determine whether it will affect your conclusions of your final mapping report. So that was a lot of different topics we went through here in a short amount of time. But thank you very much, and I would love to hear if there are any questions or answers. I can see we have a lot being answered throughout the webinar here.
Thank you, Jakob, and thank you all out there for being very frequent on the chat, and also answering some of the quick polls I pulled up. Jakob, first of all, let's start with one of the polls that has been running. The first one is about the box plots that I'm generally very interested in. So let's see here if I can show it. Yeah. Do you use box plots as graphs in your mapping reports? I just want to use the occasion to talk a bit more about box plots, because we had quite a few questions about like how do you actually determine box plots, and I know you touched base on this, but I understand also that it does require once in a while that you have some softwares that can help you here.
Absolutely.
It is really interesting. Like it speeds up your work, doesn't it, to be able to determine these kind of things very efficiently?
I think specifically box plots are really good at showing general tendencies. I mean, it should always be used in conjunction, in my view, at least with the time series data. It also shows whether there are any spurious behaviors or whatever. But box plots can generally give a really good indication as to where the general tendencies are for higher, lower variations in temperature and higher, lower temperatures in general. And the same goes for relative humidity, as an example. You have general areas that are affected a lot or less. I think a key factor of the box plot is also that it filters out a lot of those sporadic temperature changes. So if you have a position close to a door, for example, and it's only open one a day, those sporadic temperature changes will be filtered out if you set up your box plot correctly. And it gives a much better indication of what the product temperature would be if you had a product stated there. It's much closer to, for example, using a mean kinetic temperature in a much more graphical way. We use it a lot in order to identify these risk zones, things which you cannot do just by looking at time series data, that's for sure. But I think an important thing to keep in mind with box plots is that you need to be able to justify to the auditor why you used it and that you understand how to read it. That's sometimes very important. So don't just use it, but there's some really good knowledge online, I'm sure.
Yeah, and something else, like, you know, when you opt for using software applications from GxP, it's part of the suite that we can visualize.
Absolutely, that's also the reason why we've implemented it in our software. It's just such a powerful tool to view data, rather than just what I find often is there's a sort of a hunt for the hot and cold spots by single temperature, and it really, in my mind, does not make any sense to look at single points of temperature. Especially without not even taking into account the calibration uncertainty, then it does not make sense.
Jakob, another thing that I'm very intrigued by, I'm sorry, I just got a bit of water in my throat there. Something that I'm also intrigued by, Jakob, is your ability to talk about these kind of like non-binary conclusions, because we're working in a scientific area, and normally people would think that everything is binary. There's a yes and no to everything. There is a logical explanation about everything. But actually, like, being able in this room with all you guys out there to talk about that the natural sciences are not non-binary. There are a lot of factors.
Absolutely. And I think it's just like reviewing calibration certificates. I think often what is sometimes being misused as an example, a calibration certificate is a single point in time measurement, and under very specific circumstances, those were the results obtained. That does not mean that for a full year, the device in a specific scenario will measure exactly that temperature. I think it's one key thing to remember is, for example, for data loggers, as every single sensor measures one temperature, and that's the temperature of the sensor. And how do we correlate that to product temperature? That's the difficult part. How do we correlate and create traceability between the measurements that we've made and actual product temperature? And one of those things is through mapping studies. One of those things is through calibration of data loggers. But it's very important to remember that there are large variations in this. And that's also why I believe much more in the risk-based approach, where we're trying to identify risk rather than coming with hard conclusions. And of course, there needs to be some levels of acceptability, that's for sure. That's why we have process limits and process specifications. But it's very, we've seen cases where it was 0.1 degree off being non-compliant and was still passed on as being compliant. And that's not really the idea behind doing a temperature mapping. It's basically to feed back into constant quality management, in my mind at least.
And as you know, I really, really love that perception, because this is the ability to get smarter. Like, there might not always be a yes and no, but there's always ability to get smarter at what we do. And an experimental study like this, what it really is an ability to get a lot more smart. And that's something we really practice in here with the entire idea about this kind of suite of products that we have, is that imagine having like one place where you store all this information. Like, you have validations and mappings, then you have the ongoing monitoring, and then you have the ongoing calibrations. When you have that located in one place, then you have the grounds to do trending analysis over time, doing remap, really put them into a context. And this is where you start being able to take some like almost binary conclusions when you have all that data gathered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to promote at least the idea of this being a risk-based approach, right? I mean, that we are basically trying to minimize risk. And just by having a compliant temperature mapping report does not mean we have temperature compliant storage conditions. So it's really about much rather than trying to ensure that you have a commissioning document which the auditor will like. I think it's much more important that we try to minimize risk to products. That's really what we're here for. And in the end, it's risk to patients. And I think that's a very important message.
Jakob, another one that I pulled out, and I set this poll up incorrectly, because I did, very quickly, just WHO, ISPE, and then, other, because I know you guys, you have most likely your internal guidelines also, and maybe even national guidelines in your specific country where you come from. And I know that once in a while you use them all at once. So that's why I'm sure some of you out there was like, yeah, but I use this and this and this. So, how do I actually answer this one? Yeah, can you put a bit of like comments to this one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this aligns well with what our experience is that the WHO guideline is the most broadly used. It's also the least specific. But in my view, there are no contradictions between the WHO and the ISP guidelines. The ISP guidelines are much more detailed and give some more concrete examples of when to use different strategies. So in that sense, I think it makes good. I would say if you use the WHO guidelines, you're a good 80% there. The ISP has a few hundred more pages, but it does not necessarily add that much more value. There are specific scenarios where I would often go back to the ISP guidelines as sort of being the baseline. But there are also other standards out there. There's the DKDR 5.7, which is much more technical in nature, which has not generally been accepted by the pharma or the GxP industry, but it holds a lot more technical data on how you can evaluate the uncertainties. But in general, we see a lot of people referring to the WHO guidelines for sure.
Nice. Yeah, and drop us a chat message out there. I'm mega curious about what are you seeing out there basically in your home country and in your state. That could be.
I think maybe just to follow up, and you came with a good question: which guideline is more effective? And I think just to put a few words on that. The ISP guideline is on controlled temperature chamber mapping and monitoring. So it actually holds a lot of this correlation, as I talked about before, between the mapping and the actually ongoing operation and monitoring of it. So if you're much more interested in how to gain value from this mapping report and how to do monitoring afterwards, I would definitely recommend the ISP guideline. It's much more specific and it gives great considerations in terms of how to set up both the mapping and monitoring. And maybe just to follow up this John McKay, thank you very much for asking, are there any FDA guidelines or EMA guidelines? That's a really good question as well. No, there is not. Some places they refer to what they call international standards, and I read that as the ISP standards. In both the FDA Code of Federal Regulation and in the EMA guidelines as with the European Union, they state that in very broad terms that facilities and equipment should be suitable for storage and should take into considerations environments that can impact the quality of the product. That's sort of it. That's very, very hard to go from that to mappings, but the industry standard and the expectations from auditors is that you follow guidelines, either the WHO or ISP or similar guidelines. There's really no way to go around it. FDA has slightly more specifications in terms of what they expect, but the predicate rules are that it should be documented, should be taken into consideration, and it should be tested. Then those are the things. There's really no way around it.
Right. And Jakob, I think we're just about being 3 minutes over time now. So Jan, maybe you are going to stop us, but before you do that, I just wanna do one last thing. By the way, thank you out there in the chat for being so active. Also, thank you to Anja. Anja, our trusted colleague that is constantly following us as covering the audience chat with super good answers. Thank you very much, Anja. It's really nice to follow that. Lastly, Jakob, just want to pull this poll out for everybody out there to see it. Like, do you use non-binary conclusions in your report? And at least it seems to be a thing that either can be followed up on, or maybe there's a reason that you don't use non-binary conclusions out there.
I think I understand it, and I think it's in some sense it varies slightly from what you could consider normal validation. If you're doing medical device validation, software systems validation, in which results are very reproducible. And in that sense, it's often required to have a binary conclusion. But that's one part where I think mapping sort of deviates from standard process validation. To to
Right.
exactly.
And yeah, I'm just gonna pull your picture up in the panel. It's coming now. Hi, Anja. Thanks for helping us once again during the chat. And I don't know if your microphone is actually on, but did you have any like comments for what you've seen in the chat, or any like just fast feedback on what you've seen during the chat correspondence and all the questions that you have answered? And just to give you a moment to think about that, out in in the section on the chats, there is a handout section. Please just confirm for us in the chat that you're able to get our handout and have a look at this template that we've shared with you, which is a mapping report template. Thank you. Hi, Anja. Oh, let me see. I just need to. There you go. I think you can speak now.
I think so too.
Hello.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Well, I have one comment here because I can see that the incoming questions here in the end of the webinar has to do with calibration. And I thought that's very interesting because we've just covered this in 2 different webinars where we were very into the specifics of calibration. So I want to put just a little add-on for that to see that we have more information about this topic as well. So maybe Jakob can expand a bit on this.
I definitely can. I would also suggest going back and reviewing some of those webinars. But basically, calibration is the baseline requirement for actually being able to trust your measurements. But I think we can do a whole webinar on that topic alone. So I think in the interest of time, I'll cut it there for everyone's sake.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anja, and good to finally see you here with a camera on us. You've been covering the chat for a long while in our webinars, and doing really well there. So basically, this leaves me with just the final notes on this particular webinar about creating GxP compliant mapping reports. As you know, it's a topic that we're really concerned about, and a topic that we do every day, work with in here. So reach out to us afterwards if you have further questions that we could be helpful with, perhaps helping you with creating reports, etc. That would be a splendid option for us to opt in on. And then I would just like to thank Jakob for your hard work up to this, Anja again, Niels for the production of all the graphics that we always have the luxury of presenting something that looks great, and then Jan obviously for once again hosting it and sending out the certificates for all attendees after this webinar. And then lastly, for all you guys out there, it's so crazy that we have an audience of this size every time. Today we reached 140 participants. I'm really amazed by it constantly. We have been at almost 1,000 participants, but I'm still amazed by it every time we open up the webinar and see so many relevant and people that are interested in the same topics as us, and ability to geek out for a while in a room of and a space of 60 minutes. So thank you very much out there for participating in this. We keep bringing this on. It's really a topic that we care for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for another great webinar, guys. So I'm putting it in the chat right now, our upcoming webinar with you guys next year, the 5 hidden causes of temperature compliance. So everybody who enjoyed this topic, please make sure to go to this link and reserve your spot already now. And we will see you then next year. And I'm happy to finalize, to have you, Pri, and Adam and Jakob with us for one of our last sessions for this year before we head to 2024. It was an incredible time with you. We had so many great events, and I'm looking forward for next year. So thank you, Adam, Jakob, Anja, for the great work together this year, and to all our amazing participants. Let's keep our compliance high and strong, and we'll continue next year on a strong note. So have a great day, all of you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Have a great day and Merry Christmas to you out there.